An axe bit deep into cedar and the whole tree screamed as it fell. A man swung again and again, sweat freezing on his back in the cold. Splinters flew, sawdust caught in the wind. The wind screamed down off the mountain. He didn't stop when his hands blistered. He didn't stop when the blisters broke. Log by log, he dragged the timber up the ridge and stacked it into walls. He built a hearth. He built a nursery. He built a porch that faced the sunrise. All of it for a woman he had never met, whose name he did not yet know. His name was Silas Ravenscroft, and every wolf in the territory feared him. But nobody understood why the most dangerous man in Montana would build a house for a stranger. What was he hiding inside those carved and quiet rooms? Stay with me on this one. Now here's what you need to understand about Silas Ravenscroft. He was big, military big, shoulders like a barn door, a thick neck, hands that could crush river stones. When he walked through the town of Hollow Pine, men stepped off the boardwalk to let him pass. Not because he asked them to, because something in their gut told them to, and they were right to listen. They called him the Alpha King. Most of them didn't know why. They just knew that the Timberwolf territory above the ridge belonged to him, and that men who wandered too far up that mountain sometimes didn't wander back down. The pack was his. Every wolf on that mountain answered to Silas, and Silas answered to no one. Here's the thing they didn't know. Silas wasn't just the leader of the wolves. Silas was a wolf, a real one. The kind that runs on 4 legs under a full moon, with teeth that could open a man from throat to belt. He'd carried that secret his whole life, and it had cost him everything soft a man is supposed to have. No wife, no children, no one who knew his real face and stayed, because the last person who saw him change had run screaming down the mountain and never come back. So Silas made a decision, a strange one, maybe a foolish one. He decided he'd build a life first and fill it later. He climbed the ridge above Hollow Pine, and he cut cedars for 3 months straight. He raised a 2-story house with his own 2 hands. He laid a stone hearth wide enough to warm a whole family. He carved the mantel by candlelight, little wolves and pine trees pressed into the wood. Upstairs, he built a small room with a window facing east, and he called it the nursery, though there was no child and no mother and no reason on God's earth to believe there ever would be. The pack thought he'd lost his mind. His second, a lean gray wolf of a man named Cole, said it plain one evening. "You built a nest, Silas, for what? No woman crosses these borders and lives, you know that. A lone she-wolf steps foot on this mountain, the pack tears her apart before sunrise. That's the law, your law." And Silas said, "I didn't send for a wolf." He'd written a letter, you see. He'd written east to an agency in Chicago that matched lonely frontier men with women looking for a fresh start, a mail-order bride. He kept the letter simple. He said he had a house, a good one, on a mountain with clean air and a view of the sunrise. He said he was a quiet man and he'd never raise a hand to a wife. He didn't say what he was. How could he? You don't write that in a letter. Weeks passed. Then a reply came in careful, looping handwriting. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, a schoolteacher from back east, 29 years old, no family left to speak of. She wrote that she was tired of other people's children and wanted a home of her own. She wrote that she wasn't afraid of hard country, and at the bottom, in smaller letters, she'd written one line that Silas read maybe 40 times. "I have never had a place that was mine. I would like to try." He set the date. She'd come on the spring mail coach, soon as the passes cleared. And every day until then, Silas stood on that porch at dawn, watching the sun come up over the pines, terrified. Because he knew the truth, even if she didn't. He was bringing a woman up a mountain full of wolves who killed strangers. He was bringing her into a house built by a monster. And the blood moon, the one night a year when the change takes every wolf whether they want it or not, whether they fight it or not, the blood moon was less than a month away. He told himself he had time. He told himself he'd send her back down the mountain before it rose, put her up in town, keep the two worlds apart. He told himself a lot of things standing on that porch. He'd walk the borders those nights, checking the scent markers, listening to the pack move through the dark, and he'd tell himself the plan was clean. One night, he'd hand her a room in town, some story about business, and by the time the moon set she'd be none the wiser. It sounded simple when he said it to the wind, but the mountain had its own plans. It always does. Down in the pack, word spread that the king was bringing a human woman up the ridge. Some of the wolves didn't like it. A human meant risk. A human meant eyes that might see too much. And there was one among them, a big brute named Garrick, who'd wanted Cole's place at Silas's right hand and been passed over, who liked it least of all. Garrick started whispering. He said a king who lets a human into the den is a king gone soft. He said soft kings don't last. He'd say it low, around the cook fires, to the young ones who didn't remember what Silas had been like in his hard years. He'd say the mountain used to mean something. He'd say a man who carves cradles for nobody has forgotten what he is. Cole heard some of it, and he came to Silas and told him straight. Garrick's counting heads, he said, testing who'd stand where if it came to standing. I don't like it. And Silas heard the whispers too. He always heard everything. He just fixed his eyes on the eastern sky and waited for the coach. The morning Alina Whitfield arrived, the whole pack held its breath. The mail coach rattled into Hollow Pine a little past noon, all mud and creaking wheels. A woman stepped down. She was smaller than they'd expected. Plain travel dress, dark hair pinned up under a modest hat, one small trunk that she carried herself, waving off the driver who offered to help. She had a straight back and a quiet face and eyes that took in everything without saying much. She asked the way up the ridge. And when they told her, when they warned her, because a couple of the town folk did try to warn her, in that careful way people warn you off a thing they're afraid of, she just nodded and thanked them and started walking. Up on the mountain, hidden in the tree line, a dozen wolves watched a lone woman climb toward the house on the ridge. They watched her stop halfway to catch her breath and look out at the valley below. They watched her keep going, up and up, her trunk banging against her leg the whole way. Garrick's voice came low through the trees. She won't last the week. Now most stories will tell you the woman was afraid, that she climbed that mountain with her heart in her throat. Alina Whitfield wasn't afraid, and that was the first thing that told Silas something was different about her, though he didn't understand it yet. She reached the top of the ridge just as the afternoon light went gold, and there he was. Silas Ravenscroft, standing on the steps of the house he'd built, in a clean shirt he'd bought special, looking for all the world like a wild thing someone had put clothes on and told to behave. Big, rough. A face that had never learned how to soften. The kind of man a proper schoolteacher from back east should have taken one look at and turned right around. Alina set down her trunk in the dirt. She looked at him. He looked at her. Nobody said a word. The whole pack in the trees went dead still. And then she did something nobody expected. She walked past him, not away from him, toward the house. She climbed the steps, put her hand on the door he'd hung himself, and pushed it open. Silas turned and watched her step inside. She stood in the front room a long moment, taking it in. The wide stone hearth, the clean-swept floor, the stairs going up. And then she crossed to the mantel and she reached out and she ran her hand slow along the carved wood, over the little wolves and the little pine trees, feeling every ridge he'd cut by candlelight. Silas came to the doorway. His heart was hammering in a way it hadn't since he was a boy. He didn't know what she'd say. He'd built up every terrible version of it in his head, that she'd ask when the coach ran back to town, that she'd say it was too rough, too far, too much. Alina turned around. There was something wet in her eyes, but her voice was steady. "You made this," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I did," said Silas. She looked around the room one more time, slow, like she was memorizing it. Then she looked back at him, and she said the words that Cole, hidden in the trees, would swear he heard on the wind, though that was impossible at that distance. "It's home," she said. "This is home." And something in Sela's Ravenscroft, some knot he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there, came loose. Now here's where the trouble started, because at that exact moment an old gray dog came out of the tree line. You'd have called him a timber hound. Big, shaggy, more gray than any other color, with one clouded eye and a limp in his back leg. Nobody in the pack owned him. He'd just always been around, older than anyone could remember, hanging at the edges of the mountain like a piece of the mountain itself. The wolves left him alone. There was something in his smell they couldn't place, and wolves don't trouble what they can't place. The old hound they called Ash walked right up the steps, past Sela's like he wasn't there, and pressed his big gray head against Eleanor Whitfield's hip. And Eleanor, this woman who just climbed a mountain full of killers, dropped to her knees in her travel dress and took that ugly old dog's face in both hands like she'd known him her whole life. "Well, hello," she murmured. "Hello, you." Ash looked up at her with his one good eye, and I want you to understand something. That dog had never once in all his long years on that mountain let a single soul touch his face. Sela's watched them, and a cold thought slid through him, quiet as a snake. That dog knows something, he thought. That dog knows something I don't. The days that followed were, God help him, good ones. Eleanor Whitfield moved into the house on the ridge like she'd been born to it. She wasn't a shrinking thing. She got up before him, had the fire going and coffee on when he came down. She cleaned. She cooked. She hung the few things from her little trunk on the walls, and somehow the house that had felt like a held breath started to feel like a place where people actually breathed. They were married quiet in the second week, by a circuit preacher who came up the ridge and left the same afternoon, plainly relieved to be going. Sela's kept to his side of the bed those first nights, terrified of himself, of what he might do in his sleep, of the low animal thing that lived under his skin. Eleanor didn't push. But she didn't flinch from him either. She'd rest her hand on his forearm at the supper table, over the hair and the scars, and she'd leave it there. And that old gray hound Ash never left her side, slept across her feet, followed her to the well, watched Sela's over her shoulder with that one clouded eye, always watching like he was waiting for the man to make a mistake. There were small things, too, in those days that Sela's turned over and over at night. Eleanor never startled at a sound outside. A branch would crack in the dark, the kind of crack that meant something heavy moving through the trees, and where a town woman would have gone stiff, Eleanor would just tilt her head a moment and go back to her book. She knew which way the wind was coming before she opened the door. She left the last of the meat out on the step some nights, and by morning it was gone, and she never once wondered aloud what took it. Sela's noticed all of it. He filed it away. He told himself it meant she was brave. He told himself it meant she was country-raised. He told himself everything except the true thing, because the true thing was too much to hope for and too much to fear at the same time. Sela started to let himself believe. Maybe, he thought, maybe I can hold the two worlds apart. Maybe she never has to know. He'd send her to town when the blood moon came, just the one night. She'd never have to see. He could have this quiet. This woman running her hand along a mantle and calling it home. A man's allowed a little peace, isn't he, after everything? One evening near the end of that second week, they sat by the fire. Eleanor had a book. Sela's whittled a small thing he wouldn't show her yet, a spoon, for the kitchen, though in truth he'd started carving a tiny cradle and lost his nerve. The old hound slept between them. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had finally died. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Sela's Ravenscroft was not afraid. He should have been. Because down in the trees in the dark, Garrick was watching the house. And Garrick had brought the pack. The door didn't knock. It burst. Garrick came through it like a battering ram, 3 wolves behind him, and the quiet, warm room turned in 1 second into a room full of teeth. Eleanor was on her feet. The book hit the floor. Silas was already between her and them, and the low sound coming out of his chest was not a sound a man makes. "Easy, King," Garrick said, and he was grinning, the ugly, confident grin of a man who's finally decided to take what he wants. "We're not here for you, we're here for her." He jabbed a thick finger past Silas at Eleanor. "You brought a stranger onto the mountain. You know the law, your law, so we put it to the pack since you've gone soft. And the pack says the woman's got no right to these borders." "She's my wife," Silas said. "She's a trespasser," said Garrick, "and there's something else. Something you'd know too if you weren't so lovesick you can't smell your own hand in front of your face." He turned his head slow and looked at Eleanor Whitfield, and he breathed in deep, long, and deliberate. "Go on, King. Really smell her. She's been in your house 2 weeks. Tell me she smells like a human woman." And Silas, for the first time, stopped looking at Eleanor's face and started looking at everything else. The way old Ash had known her. The way she'd never once flinched. The branch cracking in the dark and her not turning a hair. The meat gone from the step by morning. The way she'd climbed a mountain full of wolves without a flicker of fear because, and it hit him like the cedar tree hitting the ground, because she'd smelled them the whole way up, and she wasn't afraid because she was one of them. Eleanor Whitfield was a wolf, a lone she-wolf. The very thing his own law said the pack should have torn apart at the border before her first sunrise. Now here's where I've got to stop and say something, because this next part is the whole reason you clicked. If you've made it this far, if you're feeling this the way I'm telling it, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps these stories find the people who love them. Now, back to that room and the 4 wolves and the truth standing between them all. Silas turned to Eleanor. His voice came out low. "Is it true?" She didn't look away. That was the thing about her. She never looked away. "I've been alone my whole life," she said quietly. "Packless. Every territory I ever crossed, they ran me off or worse. A lone she-wolf doesn't get a home, Silas. She gets chased. So I learned to smell like nothing. I learned to look like a schoolteacher. And then a letter came from a man on a mountain who said he'd built a house for a stranger. Her eyes were bright and hard. I didn't come here to trick you. I came here because I was so tired of running that I was ready to die in a real house instead of a ditch." Garrick laughed. "Hear that, King? She lied her way into your den, and now the law's the law. Step aside." Silas Ravenscroft did not step aside. What he did was turn his back on his wife, square his shoulders to Garrick, and say 4 words in a voice that dropped the temperature of the whole room. "Get off my ridge." The fight was fast and it was ugly. Garrick lunged. Silas met him. 2 big men crashing through the front room of a house built by hand, splintering a chair, cracking the very mantle Eleanor had run her hand along. The 3 others moved to circle, and that's when the old gray hound Ash came off the floor. He didn't move like an old dog anymore. He hit the nearest wolf broadside and took him down, and the 2 others hesitated because there was that smell again, the one none of them could place, and now it filled the whole room and it made the hair stand up on their necks. Silas got Garrick's throat under his forearm and slammed him into the wall so hard the whole house shook. He put his mouth close to the man's ear. "You brought the pack against my wife," he growled. "Under my roof. There's only one law that matters now, and it's mine. Get down the mountain, all of you, and if you come back before the blood moon, I will bury you on it." He threw Garrick at the door. The big man scrambled up, blood on his teeth, hate in his eyes, and for one moment it looked like he'd come again. Then he thought better of it. He and the other 3 backed out into the dark, and Garrick's voice came from the black tree line, ragged and full of promise. "The blood moon, King," he called. "It's tomorrow night. You can't stop the change. Nobody can. And when it takes you, when you're just an animal like the rest of us, we'll settle this then. You and your lying bride both." Then they were gone and the wind came back, and the only sound in the ruined room was the fire and the panting of an old gray dog. Silas turned to Alina. The truth was out. All of it. Hers, and in about 24 hours his. "There's something I have to tell you," he said, "before tomorrow night." And Alina Whitfield, standing in the wreck of her home, wiped a smear of blood from his cheekbone with her thumb and said, "I already know what you are, Silas. I've known since the first night. You forget." A sad little smile. "I can smell you too." The blood moon rose the next night like a wound in the sky, low and huge and the color of old rust. And no wolf on that mountain, king or outcast, brute or bride, could stand against what it does. Silas felt it coming up from the ground through his boots by late afternoon. He'd sent Alina to town, or he'd tried. He'd saddled the horse and begged her, and she'd refused. Flatly. She said a wife doesn't run down the mountain and leave her husband to face the worst night of the year alone. She said she'd faced blood moons alone in ditches her whole life, and she was done facing them alone. So they were both there on the ridge when it took him. I won't dress it up. The change is a terrible thing to watch. It bends a man backward. It breaks and reknits every bone. Silas fought it as long as he could, gripping the porch rail he'd nailed with his own hands, because he was afraid not of the pain. He was used to pain, but of what he'd do when the man went out of him and only the animal was left. He'd hurt people before in his younger years on nights like this. He couldn't bear the thought of turning and seeing fear in Alina's face, or worse, of turning and being the thing that put her in the ground. "Go inside," he gasped, on his knees now. "Please lock the door, don't watch this." Alina Whitfield did not go inside. She knelt down in the dirt in front of him, right in the path of the thing he was becoming, and she took his shaking face in both her hands the exact way she'd taken the old dog's face 2 weeks before. "Look at me," she said. "You built a nursery, Silas. You carved wolves into the mantel. You built a whole house around the animal you were terrified to show anybody, and you never once meant a bit of harm to a living soul with it. A monster doesn't build a nursery." Her thumbs moved over his cheekbones as the bones started to shift under them. "I'm not going anywhere. I already called this home. I meant it." And then, as the change tore through him and the man went under and the great dark wolf rose up in his place, huge and wild and half again the size of any wolf that mountain had ever seen, Alina said the thing. The thing the old hound had been waiting for. The thing that shocked every wolf listening from the trees and shocked Silas most of all, in whatever part of him was still able to be shocked. She let go of his face. She stood up. And in front of the risen blood moon, Alina Whitfield began to change too. "You never have to hide from me," she said as her own bones began to bend. "Because I've been hiding my whole life, and I'm done. So change, Silas, change all the way, and when you're done, run with me." 2 wolves stood on that ridge under the blood moon, one massive and dark, one lean and gray, and where the man had braced for a monster, he found a mate. That's when Garrick and his pack came out of the trees for the last time. They'd counted on the king being alone, a raging animal with no mind left to lead. What they found was the king, yes, but standing shoulder to shoulder with a she-wolf who fought like she had 19 years of rage stored up in her, because she did. And they found something else. They found Old Ash, because here's the last secret of the mountain. The old gray hound, the one nobody owned, the one who'd been there longer than anyone could remember, the one with the smell no wolf could place. Ash wasn't a dog. He was the oldest wolf of all, the one from before Silas's grandfather, the one the mountain itself remembered. He'd been waiting, all those long years in that borrowed shaggy shape, for the right pair to finally come home to that ridge. He'd known Alina for what she was the second she topped the rise. That's why he'd pressed his head to her hip. He'd been welcoming his own. And when Garrick came for the king and his bride, the old one shed his gray shape at last and rose up between them, and the sight of what he truly was broke the challenger's nerve like dry kindling. It was over quick after that. Garrick, to his credit or his shame, came at Silas one final time. Silas put him down. Not dead, the king had had enough of killing on his mountain, but beaten and marked and finished as any kind of threat. The other three showed their bellies in the dirt and whined for mercy, and mercy is what they got, on the condition they never again raised a tooth against the woman on the ridge. By the time the blood moon crossed over the top of the sky, the fight was long done, and 3 wolves ran the ridgeline together under the red light. The dark one, the gray one, and the ancient one loping easy at their flank home at last after all his waiting. When the sun came up, Alina Whitfield woke on the porch her husband had built to face the sunrise, wrapped in a blanket, a man's heavy arm around her. Both of them human again, both of them scratched and bruised and whole. Silas was already awake. He'd been watching the light come up over the pines, the way he'd watched it every morning of that long, lonely spring, waiting for a coach and a stranger. Only now the stranger was here, warm against his side, and he understood at last why he'd built the house before he ever wrote the letter. "I didn't know who I was building it for," he said quietly. "All those months, everybody thought I'd gone mad. Building rooms for a family I didn't have, a nursery for a child that didn't exist." He turned and looked at her. "I think somehow I was building it for someone who needed a home as bad as I needed to give one. I just didn't have the words for it." Alina pulled the blanket tighter and leaned her head against his shoulder. Down at their feet, the old gray hound had come back to his borrowed shape and lay in the morning light with his one good eye half closed, content in a way the mountain hadn't felt in 100 years. "You know what I thought," she said, "climbing that ridge with my one little trunk. I thought, if this goes wrong, at least I'll have seen a real house one time before the end. I never let myself want more than that. Wanting more when you're alone, that's how it breaks you." She was quiet a moment. "And then I walked in and put my hand on that mantle, and I felt every cut you made in it, and I thought, no, this time I'm allowed to want it. This time I get to keep it." The pack came up the ridge that afternoon, all of them, not to challenge, to kneel. Cole first, then the rest, one by one in the dirt in front of the house, acknowledging the king, and for the first time in the history of that mountain, a queen. A lone she-wolf who'd crossed the borders and not only survived but ended up the heart of the whole pack. The very thing the old law said was impossible. Silas changed the law that day. He stood on the porch he'd built and he told them plain. No wolf who comes to this mountain looking for a home gets torn apart at the border. Not while he was king, not while she was queen. The mountain had room, it always had. It had just been ruled by fear so long that everyone forgot. Word of it spread the way stories do. Over the next years others came. Lone wolves, packless ones, the chased and the running, the ones who'd never had a place that was theirs. They climbed the ridge with fear in their throats, expecting teeth. And what they found at the top was a 2-story house, and a woman with dark hair going gray now who'd meet them on the porch and put a hand on their shoulder and say, "You're all right. You're all right now. You're home." And that nursery, the one Silas built for a child that didn't exist, the one that made the whole pack think he'd lost his mind, it didn't stay empty. But I'll leave that part for you to imagine, the way old storytellers do, standing on a porch that faces the sunrise, on a mountain where a wild, half-tamed king once swung an axe alone in the freezing dark, building room after room for a stranger he couldn't name, because some part of him already knew that somewhere out east, A woman with a straight back and a small trunk and eyes that never looked away was tired enough of running to finally come home. She walked in. She ran her hand along the mantel. She called it home, and it was.